Story 1. An unending detour. I've always been the kind of person who takes the same route home every day. No matter how monotonous, there's comfort in predictability, especially after a long day at work. This happened in the fall of 2017, during one of those chilly nights where the air is crisp, and the sky feels heavier somehow. I had just finished a late shift at the diner where I worked as a manager. It was past midnight, and I was exhausted, ready to fall into bed the moment I got home. My usual drive took me about 25 minutes, cutting through a quiet stretch of highway surrounded by dense woods. That night, the drive started normally. My car hummed along the empty road, the headlights carving a path through the darkness. I remember glancing at the radio clock 12:37 a.m., exactly when I first saw the detour sign. It stood out, bright orange with reflective letters, planted just before an intersection I'd driven through hundreds of times. Road closed ahead. Follow detour. It wasn't entirely unusual to see roadwork signs in our area, though I couldn't recall hearing anything about construction on this stretch of highway. Still, I didn't think twice. I turned onto the side road as instructed, expecting a quick reroute. At first, the detour seemed straightforward. The signs led me down a narrow, winding path, bordered by towering trees that seemed to press closer with every turn. The road was unfamiliar, but I trusted the arrows pointing the way. That was until I realized I had been driving for much longer than I should have. It felt like I'd been circling back on myself, passing the same crooked tree, leaning over the road, the same rusted mailbox perched crookedly on a post. My stomach tightened as I noticed the next sign wasn't pointing in the same direction as before. The thing is, I'm not the kind of person who spooks easily. I grew up in this area, and I know the roads pretty well, or so I thought. But something about the way the detour signs seemed to shift positions didn't feel right. I stopped the car, turning off the engine for a moment, and the silence hit me like a physical force. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just this oppressive stillness that made my ears ring. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired, and started the car again. As I drove on, the signs became less consistent. One arrow pointed left, only for the next two to direct me right, doubling back the way I'd come. It wasn't long before I realized I had looped back to the same dead-end road, an overgrown cul-de-sac, with a warped wooden sign that read, "Private Property." The first time I saw it, I thought it was just a wrong turn. But the second time, I knew something was wrong. My knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to shake off the rising unease. I figured maybe the signs were just poorly placed, or I'd missed a turn somewhere in the dark. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use GPS. But of course, there was no signal. Not even a single bar. That was unusual for the area. I'd never had an issue with service before. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I sat there, staring into the dense wall of trees. It felt like they were watching me somehow, leaning closer to box me in. With no other options, I decided to retrace my path to where I'd first seen the detour sign, thinking I'd just head back to the highway and take another route home. But as I drove back, the road didn't lead where it should have. Instead, it twisted and curved in ways I didn't recognize. The pavement narrowing until it felt more like a dirt trail than a proper road. The signs continued to appear, but they were different, now smaller, bent at odd angles, almost as if they'd been hastily shoved into the ground. They pointed me deeper into the woods, and every time I passed one, I could swear it hadn't been there before. After what felt like an hour of driving in circles, I came to a stop again, my heart pounding in my chest. The same dead-end road stretched before me, but this time, the air felt heavier. The trees surrounding the cul-de-sac seemed impossibly tall, their twisted branches blotting out the sky. The warped private property sign stood crooked as ever. But now there was something else, a faint glimmer of light flickering through the trees. It wasn't the warm golden glow of a house or street lamp. This light was cold and unnatural, pale like the reflection of the moon on water. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window, craning my neck to get a better look. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding far too small in the vast, oppressive silence. There was no response, only the sound of my own breath and the steady thrum of my heart in my ears. And then, just as I was about to give up and drive away, I heard a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. My pulse spiked as I stared into the dark, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It wasn't just rustling anymore. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any small animal. They were coming closer, crunching through the dry leaves and twigs. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my body felt frozen, as if the air itself had thickened around me, rooting me in place. I forced myself to snap out of it, slamming the window shut and locking the doors. My hands fumbled as I shifted the car into reverse, the headlights casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and claw at the surrounding trees. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. It felt as if whatever had been out there was now watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. As I turned the car around, the light I'd seen earlier flickered again, this time closer, almost at the edge of the road. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. My eyes darted toward the glow, and for a split second, I saw something that still haunts me. It was a figure, tall and skeletal, its skin as pale and translucent as the light itself. Its eyes were where its eyes should have been, shone with the same cold glow, and its mouth was fixed in a grin that stretched far too wide. My breath caught in my throat as I hit the gas, the tires screeching against the loose gravel. The figure didn't move, but its grin seemed to grow as I sped away, disappearing back into the maze of trees and shifting signs. The road ahead felt endless, twisting and turning in ways that defied all logic. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting that thing to appear behind me, but all I saw was the dense darkness swallowing the road. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I drove aimlessly, searching for any landmark, any indication that I was getting closer to civilization. My gas gauge was dipping dangerously low, and I started to panic. What if I ran out of fuel out here? What if I was stuck in this godforsaken place forever? My thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last, until I saw something that made my heart leap. Headlights. For a moment, relief washed over me like a wave. Another car meant another person, someone who could help me. I honked and flashed my high beams, desperate to get their attention. But as the car approached, something about it seemed off. Its headlights were dimmer than they should have been, and the vehicle itself looked almost antiquated, like something from decades ago. I slowed down, rolling down my window to wave at the driver, but as the car passed, my blood ran cold. There was no one inside. The windows were pitch black, and the interior was completely empty. Yet the car moved steadily down the road, as if it had a destination. It disappeared into the darkness without a sound, leaving me shaken and more alone than ever. I gripped the wheel tighter, muttering to myself like a mantra. Just keep going. Just keep going. But no matter how far I drove, signs kept leading me back to that same dead-end road. The forest seemed alive now, shifting and closing in with every turn. It wasn't until I passed the warped private property sign for the 5th time that I realized something horrifying. I wasn't just lost. I was being herded like prey. By this point, my hands were trembling so badly that I could barely keep the car steady. The thought of leaving the vehicle crossed my mind more than once, but the idea of stepping into that suffocating darkness felt like a death sentence. The gas gauge was now hovering on empty, and I knew I didn't have much time left before the car sputtered to a stop. I needed to do something, anything, before that happened. On what must have been my 6th pass through the dead end, I made a split-second decision. Instead of turning back onto the main road, I swung the car sharply onto the overgrown path, marked private property. It was the only road I hadn't tried, and at this point, I figured I had nothing to lose. The tires crunched over roots and rocks as the car lurched forward, the beam of the headlights barely piercing the thick wall of trees ahead. The path was narrower than I expected, and the branches clawed at the sides of the car, leaving deep scratches in the paint. But as I pressed forward, the oppressive silence broke, replaced by a low, droning hum. It grew louder the farther I went, vibrating through the air and into my chest. I couldn't tell if it was mechanical or organic only, but it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then, without warning, the road ended. The car skidded to a stop at the edge of a wide clearing bathed in pale light. In the center of the clearing stood something that made my stomach drop, a massive, spiraling structure of twisted metal and wood. It looked like a grotesque monument, with pieces of cars, trees, and even road signs melded together in an impossible configuration. At its base, I saw them. Dozens of cars, all rusted and decayed. their doors hanging open like yawning mouths. They looked like they'd been there for decades. I barely had time to process the sight before I heard it again, the footsteps. They were faster this time, more urgent, crunching through the underbrush toward me. I threw the car into reverse, but it was too late. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me trapped in suffocating silence once more. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I frantically scanned the clearing for any sign of escape. That's when I saw it. A figure, pale and skeletal, stepping into the clearing with a deliberate, predatory grace. Its glowing eyes locked onto me, and I knew in that moment that I'd made a terrible mistake. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for me, hurting me. I scrambled to open the door, my legs trembling as I stumbled out of the car. The hum was deafening now, filling my head with a static-like buzz that made it impossible to think. I don't remember much after that. The last thing I recall is running blindly, desperately into the forest, the branches tearing at my skin as I fled. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me. When I woke up, it was daylight, and I was lying in a ditch on the side of a road I didn't recognize. My car was gone. My phone had no signal, and my clothes were torn and caked with mud. Eventually, a passing driver stopped and called for help, but I couldn't explain what had happened. How could I? It sounded insane, even to me. To this day, I've never found that detour again. I tried retracing my route once, out of morbid curiosity, but the signs were gone, and the road seemed completely normal. I don't know what I stumbled into that night, but sometimes, when I'm driving alone late at night, I catch myself glancing into the woods, half expecting to see that pale figure watching me from the shadows. Story 2. Emerging from the fog. I'm no stranger to long drives at night. Living in a small town in Oregon meant that if you wanted anything beyond the basics, you had to travel. I used to work as a freelance photographer, which often took me to remote locations at odd hours. This happened in late December 2019. During one of those assignments, I'd spent the day shooting landscapes for a small-town tourism campaign and was driving back home through one of the lesser-traveled highways. The air had that sharp, biting chill that comes before snow, and the sky was blanketed with thick clouds. It was around 9 p.m., and the drive was supposed to take just under 3 hours. The first hour was uneventful. The road stretched out ahead, flanked by endless fields of frosted grass and occasional clusters of leafless trees. I had the radio on, but the signal kept fading in and out, so I turned it off and let the hum of the car engine fill the void. Then, out of nowhere, a dense fog began to roll in. It wasn't the kind that creeps in slowly, giving you time to adjust. This was sudden, almost violent, like a curtain dropping over the world. One moment, I could see the road 4 miles ahead. The next, I could barely make out the faint glow of my headlights. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter as my visibility shrank to just a few feet. The fog was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. So thick it seemed to absorb light, swallowing the beams from my headlights entirely. Even the sound of the engine seemed muffled, like I was driving through a void. I thought about pulling over, but the road was narrow, and I hadn't passed another car for what felt like hours. Stopping in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by this suffocating mist, didn't feel like a safe option. As I continued driving, I began to notice something odd. The landmarks I was expecting, an old gas station, a bridge over a narrow creek, weren't appearing. I'd driven this route enough times to know it by heart, but nothing looked familiar. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs, no intersections, no mile markers. I told myself it was just the fog playing tricks on me, but deep down, I felt a gnawing sense of unease. It was like the road was leading me somewhere, guiding me farther from where I was supposed to be. After what felt like hours, I checked the clock on my dashboard. It read 10:15 p.m. That couldn't be right. I'd been driving for far longer than that. I glanced at my phone for confirmation, but there was no signal. Not even the faintest bar. My stomach churned as I realized that I had no way of knowing how long I'd been out there, or how far I'd gone. The fog seemed to thicken even more as I drove, wrapping around the car like a living thing. Every turn of the wheel felt heavier, as if the road itself resisted me. My headlights, which normally cut through the darkness with ease, now barely illuminated the asphalt ahead. I rolled down the window, hoping to at least hear something: crickets, the rustle of trees, anything, but there was only silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, unnatural. Even the faint buzz of the engine seemed muted, like I was driving underwater. That's when I saw a shadow flickering at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe a trick of the fog. But then it happened again, closer this time. A dark shape, moving just beyond the reach of my headlights. My heart started pounding as I strained to see through the thick haze. I told myself it was just a deer, or some other animal. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever it wasn't running away from the current, was following me. I pressed harder on the gas, trying to outpace the strange shadow. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The fog wasn't just thick, it was oppressive. Suffocating, as if it had a mind of its own. I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of the shadow behind me, but all I saw was the swirling mist. The absence of anything tangible only made the fear worse. It felt like I was being hunted by something invisible, something that thrived in the fog. Then the landscape around me began to change. The trees, which had been sparse and familiar, grew denser, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The fields disappeared, replaced by jagged rocks and patches of dark, stagnant water. The road, once smooth and well-maintained, became cracked and uneven, forcing me to slow down. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, but I didn't dare stop. Something in my gut told me that stopping would be a mistake I wouldn't recover from. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that the stress and exhaustion were making me hallucinate. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The lines on the road were gone. The faint white and yellow markings that guide every driver were nowhere to be seen. It was as if the road wasn't a road anymore, but something else entirely. A path I wasn't meant to be on. The clock on my dashboard still read 10:15. Frozen, as if time itself had stopped. My phone was equally useless, stuck on the same screen with no service, no updates. Panic began to creep in, the edges of my vision blurring as my breathing quickened. I had no idea where I was, or how to get out. All I could do was keep driving, hoping that somewhere, somehow, the fog would break. I don't know how long I drove like that, the fog pressing against the windows, the road stretching into infinity. At some point, I began to notice an unsettling pattern. The shapes of the trees, the cracks in the asphalt, even the pools of stagnant water, they started to repeat. I'd pass a cluster of jagged rocks on the left, only to see the exact same formation a mile later, as if the road itself was looping. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Whatever was happening, it wasn't natural. My body ached from the tension. Every muscle was coiled, every nerve on edge. I turned on the radio, hoping for some human voice, some connection to the outside world. All I got was static. I twisted the dial, searching for anything, but the static grew louder, harsher, until it sounded like whispers layered beneath the noise. I snapped it off, my hands trembling. The silence returned, but it wasn't a relief. It felt aware, as if the fog itself was listening. Then I saw lights in the distance. Not the headlights of another car, but a faint flickering glow, like lanterns swaying in the breeze. My chest tightened with a mix of hope and dread. Finally, a sign of life. But as I got closer, I realized the lights weren't coming from any building or vehicle. They hovered above the road, bobbing gently as if held by invisible hands. I slowed the car to a crawl, my pulse pounding in my ears. The lights didn't move or fade, they just hovered there. Waiting against every instinct, I rolled the car forward. As the lights came into clearer view, I noticed something else, a figure standing just beyond them, barely visible through the haze. It didn't wave or move, it simply stood there, watching. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to floor it and speed past, but another part was terrified of what might happen if I ignored it. The figure stepped forward, just enough for the glow of my headlights to catch it. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its limbs were too long, its face pale and featureless, with no eyes or mouth to speak of. But the way it tilted its head, as if studying me, sent a chill racing down my spine. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires skidding as I backed away from the lights. The figure didn't follow, but the glow of the lanterns began to dim, as if the fog was swallowing them whole. I spun the car around, heart hammering, and drove as fast as I could. The road blurred beneath me, the fog swirling in frantic patterns, almost as if it was alive. The shapes I'd seen earlier, the jagged rocks, the twisted trees blurred together into an indistinguishable mass. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. The road began to slope downward, steep and uneven, forcing me to slow despite the panic clawing at my chest. The fog seemed thicker here, clinging to the car like a living thing. My headlights barely cut through it, revealing only fragments of the path ahead: broken asphalt, patches of dirt, and the occasional shadowy outline of trees. My mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation. Was I dreaming? Hallucinating? Or worse, had I somehow wandered into a place I wasn't supposed to be? As I rounded a bend, the fog suddenly lifted, peeling away like a curtain. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief, but that feeling quickly evaporated. When I saw what lay ahead, the road was completely deserted. No signs, no mile markers, nothing to indicate where I was. It stretched into the distance, perfectly straight and unnervingly smooth, with no end in sight. On either side, the landscape was barren, flat, and colorless. The sky above was a dull, featureless gray, with no sun or stars to give me any sense of direction. I pulled over, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The silence was deafening, and the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if it was pressing down on me. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the brittle ground. The stillness was so complete, it felt like the world had stopped. There was no wind, no sound, no movement, just an endless stretch of emptiness. It was like I had driven off the map and into some forgotten corner of reality. Desperation began to take hold. I yelled into the void, my voice echoing back at me, faint and distorted. I tried calling out again, but it felt futile, as if the emptiness itself was mocking me. I turned back to the car, hoping to at least retrace my path, but the fog had returned. It hung like a wall just behind me, dense and impenetrable, cutting off the road I'd just traveled. My car sat in the clearing like a relic, the only piece of familiarity in this strange, desolate place. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the fog and the endless road ahead. My thoughts spiraled. Should I keep driving? Would I eventually find my way out? Or was I doomed to wander this empty highway forever? The longer I waited, the more the oppressive stillness began to eat away at me. It was as if the very air was whispering, coaxing me forward. Keep driving, it seemed to say. There's nowhere else to go. Eventually, I climbed back into the car. I didn't have a plan or a destination. I just knew I couldn't stay there. As I drove down the barren highway, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, hoping to see the fog receding, but it didn't. It followed me, a pale wall of mist always just out of reach, as if it was hurting me forward. The road stretched on endlessly, with no signs, no turns, no end in sight. The last thing I remember is the sound of the engine fading, replaced by an eerie, low hum. It wasn't until much later hours, days, maybe longer, that I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the road I'd started on. My phone buzzed with messages and missed calls. The clock reading 7 a.m. I had no memory of how I'd gotten back, and the fog was nowhere to be seen. The highway looked perfectly normal, as if nothing had happened. I never drove that route again. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't escape, that a part of me is still out there, driving that endless road. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in, I think I can hear the hum again, faint and distant, calling me back. Story 3. A stranger who knows too much. It was late summer, 2016. I was on my way back from a weekend camping trip in the mountains, driving down a rural highway that cut through miles of empty farmland. The sun had set about an hour earlier, leaving the sky a deep, inky blue, and the air was thick with the lingering heat of the day. I'd been driving for a couple of hours already, and my eyes were beginning to blur with exhaustion. The highway was nearly deserted, just my car and the rhythmic hum of the asphalt beneath my tires. I remember the moment I saw him clearly. A figure, standing in the glow of my high beams, just off to the side of the road. He was waving, his arm moving in slow, deliberate arcs, like he knew I'd stop. Against my better judgment, I slowed the car, my foot hovering over the brake as I tried to get a better look. He was tall and lean, wearing a weathered denim jacket and a beat-up baseball cap. Something about him seemed off, not threatening. Exactly, but not quite right either. Still, I told myself he was probably just a stranded traveler. I pulled over a few feet ahead of him, rolling down the passenger side window. "You okay?" I called out, keeping my tone casual but cautious. He nodded, his face shadowed in the dim light. "Car broke down a few miles back," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Think you could give me a ride to the next gas station?" I hesitated, glancing at the empty road ahead. A part of me wanted to say no, to keep driving and leave him there. But another part, the part that didn't want to feel guilty about leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere, won out. "All right," I said, unlocking the door. "Hop in." He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, and as soon as he shut the door, I regretted my decision. There was something unsettling about him, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he sat, too still, his hands resting on his knees as he stared straight ahead. Or maybe it was the faint smell of smoke that clung to his clothes, sharp and acrid, like a campfire gone wrong. Whatever it was, it set my nerves on edge. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the tires against the pavement and the occasional chirp of crickets from the fields. I tried to make small talk, mostly to ease my own nerves. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't look at me, just kept staring straight ahead. "Just passing through," he said, his tone clipped and vague. Something about his answer didn't sit right with me. Passing through where? This highway didn't lead to much except tiny, forgotten towns and endless stretches of farmland. Still, I decided not to press him. Instead, I focused on the road, counting down the miles to the next gas station. The tension in the car was thick, almost tangible, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. After a few more minutes, he broke the silence. "Long day for you, huh?" he said, his voice low but calm. I nodded, relieved that he was at least making an effort to talk. "Yeah, just heading home after a weekend trip," I replied. His head turned slightly toward me, and for the first time, I noticed the faint glint of his eyes in the dim light. "Camping, right?" he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. My stomach tightened. I hadn't mentioned that I'd been camping, but I told myself it was probably just a lucky guess. After all, I still had some gear visible in the back seat, a sleeping bag, a cooler. "Yeah, that's right," I said, forcing a laugh. "How'd you know?" He didn't answer right away, just turned his gaze back to the road. "Just a feeling," he said after a long pause. The next few minutes passed in uneasy silence. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles whitening as I tried to focus on driving. That's when he said something that made my blood run cold. "You should really be more careful out there," he said, his voice quiet but deliberate. "It's easy to get lost in those woods, especially around that old trailhead near the river." I froze. There was no way he could have known about the trailhead. It wasn't marked, and I'd only found it after wandering off the main path earlier that day. My heart started to race as I glanced at him again, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've been out there before?" I asked, feigning curiosity. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "But you have." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My grip on the wheel tightened, my mind scrambling for an explanation. How could he have known about the trailhead? It wasn't on any map, and I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. He didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed almost amused by my reaction. "You spent a lot of time there today," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Found that clearing, didn't you? Nice spot for photos." I felt a chill run down my spine. He wasn't guessing, he knew. "Did you follow me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The thought sent a wave of panic through me, but he just laughed a low, dry chuckle that made my skin crawl. "No need," he said, leaning back in his seat. No thanks." I wanted to slam on the brakes, to kick him out of the car and drive as far away as possible. But something about him, something I couldn't quite put into words, made me hesitate. It wasn't just fear. It was the sense that I was dealing with someone or something that didn't follow the same rules as the rest of us. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to face me fully for the first time, his expression unreadable. "Just someone passing through," he said again, his voice calm and measured. "But you've got a lot ahead of you. Some of it good, some of it not so much." He paused, his gaze lingering on me. "It's a shame about your sister, though." My heart stopped. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, just tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. "She's been sick for a while now, hasn't she? Not that she tells anyone. Stubborn, just like you." I felt a surge of anger and fear, my hands shaking as I struggled to keep the car steady. "How the hell do you know that?" I demanded, my voice rising. My sister's illness was something she'd kept private, even from most of our family. Only a handful of people knew, and this stranger, couldn't have been one of them. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice cracking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, his face calm and impassive. "Does it matter?" he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What matters is what you do next." My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what scared me more, the fact that he knew things he couldn't possibly know, or the eerie calm in his voice, as if this was all perfectly normal. I wanted to pull over, to stop the car and demand answers, but something told me that stopping would be a mistake. It felt like the only thing keeping me safe was the forward motion, the steady hum of the engine. The man tilted his head, watching me with a faint, knowing smile. "You've been driving a lot tonight," he said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "Must be tiring, carrying all that weight." I glanced at him, my throat dry. "What weight?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away, just tapped his fingers rhythmically on his knee, as if keeping time with a song only he could hear. "You'll figure it out soon enough," he said. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car lurched to a stop. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by my ragged breathing. "Get out," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't move. I said, "Get out." I repeated, louder this time. He turned to me slowly, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure that's what you want?" he asked, his voice calm. I stared at him, my heart racing. Something about the way he said it made me hesitate. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but there was an undercurrent of something. Final, I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "Yes," I said. "Get out of my car." He sighed, as if disappointed, and opened the door. "All right," he said, stepping out onto the empty highway. "But remember, some doors, once closed, can't be reopened." Before I could respond, he shut the door and walked off into the darkness. I watched him in the rearview mirror, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared into the shadows. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I felt an overwhelming urge to drive, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as I put the car in gear and started to pull away, something caught my eye. On the seat where he'd been sitting was a folded piece of paper. I hesitated, my stomach twisting as I reached over and picked it up.